The night was bitter and silent across the open plains. Snow drifted softly through the dark sky, carried by a wind that bit deep into the skin. The town of Dry Creek had already closed its doors and shuttered its windows. Inside the saloon, a small fire crackled weakly, throwing light over a man sitting alone by the window. His name was Daniel Hayes, a weathered rancher who had seen too many winters, too many deaths, and too many lonely nights. He had only a few dollars left in his pocket, enough maybe for a hot meal and a blanket. Yet something inside him felt colder than the wind outside. Daniel wasn't a cruel man, just a tired one. His ranch had burned down the previous summer in a lightning storm, his horses scattered and the cattle gone. Since then he had been drifting from town to town, taking small jobs, sleeping in barns, saving every coin he could. He dreamed of rebuilding one day, but for now he just wanted to survive the winter. When he finally left the saloon that night, he pulled his coat tight and started toward the edge of town, where his small cabin waited by the frozen creek. Halfway down the trail, he heard something faint, a cough, then a low moan carried by the wind. He stopped, his boots crunching on snow, and listened again. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. He turned toward the sound, walking slowly, and then he saw her. A figure curled up near an old wagon, wrapped in torn cloth and half covered with frost. Her hair was long and dark, her skin pale under the moonlight. She wasn't moving much. Daniel hurried closer and knelt beside her. She looked young, maybe in her early 20s. Her clothes were thin, not meant for such cold. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but only a faint whisper came out. Daniel didn't understand her words at first. They were from another tongue, the Apache language. But the fear and pain in her eyes said enough. She was freezing to death. He hesitated. A white rancher helping an Apache woman. That wasn't something most folks would understand. There had been too many fights, too much blood spilled between settlers and tribes. If someone saw him with her, questions would follow. But Daniel didn't care. He couldn't walk away. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You're gonna freeze out here," he said softly, though she couldn't understand the words. "Come on now. Let's get you warm." She barely opened her eyes, shivering as he lifted her into his arms. She was light, almost weightless. He carried her carefully through the snow, step by step, the wind cutting through his shirt now that he had given her his coat. The trail to his cabin was long and hard, but he kept going, teeth gritted, his breath coming out in thick clouds. When he reached the cabin, he pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. The cabin was small, just a single room with a fireplace, a bed, and a wooden table. Daniel laid her down gently on the bed, then rushed to start the fire. His hand shook as he struck the match. Within minutes, the flames grew, filling the room with a dim golden glow. He took one of his blankets, the last clean one he had, and covered her up. Her lips were still blue, her breathing shallow. He sat beside her and rubbed her hands to bring back warmth. After a while, she opened her eyes again. They were deep brown, almost black, and full of confusion. She whispered something, but he didn't understand. He just nodded, hoping it meant she was still holding on. He gave her a small cup of warm water, which she drank slowly, trembling. When she finished, she closed her eyes again, exhausted. Daniel sat back, watching the fire flicker. His last few dollars had gone to feed his horse and buy the firewood stacked near the door. Now he had nothing left. Nothing but a stranger in his bed, a woman who might not even survive the night. Still, something about her presence made the room feel less empty. He stayed awake, adding wood to the fire, keeping an eye on her. Hours passed. Outside, the wind howled like wolves in the hills. Every so often she would stir, whispering words in her own language. Once she flinched as if reliving a memory, her hands clutching the blanket tight. Daniel spoke softly, trying to calm her even though she couldn't understand. "You're safe now," he said. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you here." When dawn came, light crept through the frosted window. The storm had stopped and the world outside was white and silent. The woman was still alive. Her breathing was stronger now, her color returning. Daniel smiled for the first time in weeks. He heated some water on the stove and made a bit of broth from the dried meat he had left. When he brought it to her, she looked at him warily, unsure whether to trust him. Slowly, he lifted the spoon and showed her it was safe. She nodded and took a small sip. After a while, she spoke in broken English. "You help me?" she asked softly, her voice weak. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, you were out there in the snow. Would have died if I hadn't found you." She looked down, clutching the blanket. "Why?" she whispered. "I am Apache." He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you're human," he said finally. "And no one deserves to die alone in the cold." Her eyes softened. For the first time she managed a faint smile. She told him her name, Ayanna. Her voice trembled as she explained, little by little, that she had been traveling with a small group heading north. Soldiers had attacked their camp 2 days ago. She had run into the woods and wandered until she collapsed. Daniel listened quietly, his jaw tightening at her story. The West was cruel to those who had no one. As the days passed, Ayanna slowly regained her strength. She stayed inside, helping Daniel with small chores, cleaning, boiling water, mending torn clothes. Though she spoke only a little English, they began to understand each other in gestures and simple words. Daniel taught her the names of things in his language, and she sometimes laughed softly when he mispronounced her Apache words. The cabin, once lonely and quiet, now echoed with the faint sound of voices and life again. At night, Daniel often found himself watching her by the firelight, the calm way she braided her hair, the quiet strength in her movements. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. That night when he gave her his coat and carried her through the storm had changed something in him. He had spent his last dollars that night not knowing what would come next. But in saving her, he had somehow saved a part of himself too. When another snowstorm hit a week later, they both stayed inside, sitting near the fire. Ayanna looked at him and said softly, "You, good man." Daniel shook his head. "Just a fool who couldn't leave someone to die." But her eyes said she saw more in him than he believed. And though he didn't say it aloud, he knew she had brought something into that cabin that money or luck never could: warmth. Not just from the fire, but from life itself returning to a man who had thought he'd lost everything. That night, as the wind howled once more outside the cabin walls, Daniel realized that this winter might not be as lonely as he had feared. Something had changed, something quiet, fragile, but deeply human, and it had started with an act of kindness on a freezing night by the trail. The second morning came quiet and cold, with sunlight spreading weakly through the frost-covered glass. Daniel was already awake, feeding the fire before dawn. Ayanna still slept on the bed, her breathing calm and soft, her face no longer pale from the freezing night he'd found her in. For the first time in many years, the cabin didn't feel empty. There was life in it again, faint, gentle, and warm like the small fire that crackled in the hearth. When Ayanna opened her eyes, Daniel was pouring water into a tin cup. He turned and smiled awkwardly. "Mornin'. You're looking better today." She tilted her head, not understanding all his words, but she caught the tone. Kind, simple, safe. She gave a small nod. "Morning," she repeated slowly, trying his language, her accent soft but clear. Daniel grinned. "You're learning quick." She smiled faintly and reached for the cup of water. Her hands were steadier now. She had a few bruises on her arms and a scrape near her temple, but she was healing. Daniel still couldn't forget how cold she'd been when he first found her. If he'd arrived even an hour later, she might not have survived. The thought still haunted him. He cooked a little breakfast and some beans and bread he had saved. They sat across from each other at the small wooden table. She watched him closely, mimicking how he ate, careful with every bite. He noticed how polite she was, how she waited for him to eat before touching her food. "You can eat," he said with a small laugh. "Ain't no rules here." She smiled again, a shy, quiet smile, and took a small bite. For a while they ate in silence, only the sound of the fire breaking it. Outside, the snow was starting to melt, turning the land into a wet white field under the pale sun. After breakfast, Daniel put on his coat and boots. "Need to check the traps," he said, pointing toward the forest. "Food." He mimed catching something with his hands. Ayanna nodded as if she understood. When he opened the door, she hesitated, then pointed to herself and then outside. "I come?" she asked. Daniel frowned. "It's cold out there." "You sure?" She nodded again, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. He couldn't say no, so together they stepped outside into the crisp air. The ground was slippery, and she leaned lightly on him as they walked toward the tree line. The forest stretched silent and white, branches heavy with snow. The air smelled clean, untouched. They reached the first trap near a fallen log. Inside, a small rabbit lay still. Daniel crouched, checking the line. "Got one," he said. Ayana watched closely, curious, her eyes following his hands. When he showed her the rabbit, she whispered something in her own tongue, a few soft words like a prayer. Daniel didn't understand, but her tone was gentle and respectful, as if she were thanking the earth. They checked a few more traps and headed back to the cabin. By the time they reached it, her cheeks were red from the cold and her breath came in soft puffs. Daniel built the fire higher while she sat near it, warming her hands. He cleaned the rabbit quietly, trying not to startle her. She watched him for a long time before speaking. "You live alone?" she asked, her voice uncertain but brave. He nodded. "Yeah, for a long while now." She looked around the cabin, her eyes moving from the bed to the tools hanging on the wall. "No wife?" Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, ma'am. Never had time for that. Ranch life don't leave much room for family." She seemed to think about that, then said softly, "You kind man. Kind heart?" Daniel didn't know how to answer. No one had said anything like that to him in years. He just smiled a little and said, "You don't know me that well yet." Days passed and the snow slowly began to thin. Each morning, Daniel chopped wood and fetched water, while Ayana helped with small chores around the cabin. She repaired one of his torn shirts with thread she found in an old box, humming softly as she worked. Sometimes she told him simple words in her language, laughing when he tried to repeat them and got the sounds wrong. He would laugh too, embarrassed but happy to hear laughter again inside those rough wooden walls. One afternoon, a horse's distant whinny broke the calm. Daniel looked out the window and saw two riders approaching from the ridge. They wore dark coats and carried rifles. He frowned. Visitors out here were rare and rarely friendly. He told Ayana to stay inside and went to the door. As the riders got closer, he recognized them. Hank Willis and Tom Brenner, two ranch hands from town. They weren't the kindest men around. Hank called out, "Morning, Hayes. Heard you've been hiding something up here." Daniel's chest tightened. "Just trying to stay warm, same as everyone," he said evenly. Hank's eyes shifted toward the cabin window. "Folks said they saw you bring someone in that storm. Looked like one of them Apache girls. That true?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Ain't your concern, Hank," Tom spat in the snow. "You ought to be careful. People don't like mixing with their kind. Could bring trouble." Daniel stepped closer, his voice steady. "You done?" Hank smirked. "Just looking out for you, cowboy. You don't want folks thinking you gone soft." Without waiting for an answer, the two men turned their horses and rode off. Daniel watched them go until they disappeared into the trees. When he went back inside, Ayana was standing by the window, worry in her eyes. "Bad men?" she asked quietly. "Just talkers," Daniel said, trying to sound calm. "Don't you worry about them." But he did worry. The West had never been kind to those who crossed its invisible lines. Between tribes, between towns, between right and wrong. Yet when he looked at Ayana sitting by the fire, he knew he couldn't send her away. She had no one else. That night, neither of them slept much. The wind had picked up again, moaning through the cracks in the cabin walls. Daniel sat near the fire, cleaning his rifle just in case. Ayana sat across from him, watching silently. After a while, she spoke softly. "My people, call storm spirits crying." He looked up. "That so?" She nodded. "They cry for lost ones. Maybe they stop when peace come." Daniel stared into the fire. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe they're crying for folks like us too." She didn't answer, but she smiled faintly, and the silence between them grew gentle again. The next morning, Daniel went to town for supplies. He had to trade the last of his dried meat for flour and salt. When he walked into the general store, people stared longer than usual. Hank and Tom must have been talking. The shopkeeper, an older man named Carter, leaned over the counter. "You keeping company up there, Hayes?" Daniel set down his coins. "Ain't your concern," Carter shrugged. "Word gets around fast, that's all. Careful folks don't start asking questions." Daniel gathered his goods and left without another word. By the time he reached his cabin, he was boiling inside. Not with fear, but anger. People always wanted to judge what they didn't understand. When he opened the door, Ayana greeted him with a shy smile. She had swept the floor and cooked a small stew with the herbs she found nearby. The smell filled the cabin. "You back?" she said, almost cheerful. Daniel nodded, his anger fading at the sound of her voice. "Yeah, I'm back." As they ate, he told her, "People talk too much. Might be safer if you stay inside for a while." She looked at him quietly. You afraid? He shook his head. No, just careful. Ayanna reached across the table and placed her hand on his for a second, a gesture so small and gentle that it stopped his words. You help me, I stay. Not afraid, she said. Daniel looked at her, realizing how strong she really was. She had lost her people, her home, everything she knew, and yet she still had courage. He nodded slowly. Then we'll face whatever comes. That night they sat by the fire again, the glow lighting their faces. The snow outside began to fall softly once more. Ayanna hummed a low tune, something from her tribe, a melody that sounded like the wind moving through the canyons. Daniel listened quietly, letting the sound fill the small cabin. He didn't understand the words, but he felt them. It was a song of survival, of hope in dark places, and as the fire burned low, he realized that the world outside could keep its talk and its hate. In this small cabin, two souls who should have been enemies had found something better than fear. They had found peace. The days slowly passed and winter began to soften its grip. The heavy snow that had buried the forest started to melt, and thin streams of water ran down the hills. The air smelled of wet pine and earth again. Daniel had lived through many winters alone, but this one had been different. Every day when he woke up, he heard quiet movement in the cabin, Ayanna stoking the fire, boiling water, or softly humming to herself. The silence that once made him feel empty now felt peaceful. One morning he found her standing outside the cabin, staring at the sunrise. The light turned the snow pink and gold, and her dark hair shimmered in it. It's beautiful, ain't it? He said softly. She turned and smiled a little, nodding. Beautiful, she repeated, learning the word slowly. Daniel had been teaching her English one word at a time, and she learned quickly. In return, she taught him some words from her Apache tongue, words for sun, fire, friend, and spirit. They laughed often when he mispronounced them. Sometimes she would place her hand on his arm to correct him gently, and he would feel warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the fire. By now she could walk longer distances. Her strength had returned, though the memories of what had happened to her people still shadowed her eyes. She didn't talk much about it, but when she did, her voice turned quiet and far away. She told Daniel how soldiers had attacked their small camp near the river, how her brother had tried to protect her, how she had run through the snow until her legs gave out. He listened without interrupting, his hands clenched at his sides. He couldn't change the past, but he wished he could. After that talk, Daniel made her a promise. No one's gonna hurt you again, not while I'm around. She looked at him for a long time, as if measuring the truth in his eyes. Then she nodded once. I trust you, she said simply. They built a quiet rhythm to their days. Daniel worked on fixing the roof that the winter storms had nearly torn apart, while Ayanna tended to the small garden patch beside the cabin. Though the ground was still hard, she worked patiently, breaking the frozen soil with a stick in her bare hands. She told him that the earth would soon wake again, that life always came back after cold seasons. Her hope was gentle but strong, something Daniel hadn't felt in years. Sometimes in the evenings they would sit together outside and watch the stars. She told him how her people believed the stars were ancestors watching over them. Daniel listened with quiet respect. If that's true, he said once, I hope they see you safe now. She looked at him and said, and you, safe too. One afternoon, while chopping wood, Daniel saw movement through the trees. A horse, his body tensed. A rider was heading toward the cabin, and as the man came closer, Daniel recognized him. It was Sheriff Colton, the lawman from Dry Creek. He was a fair man, but not one to overlook gossip. Daniel wiped his hands and waited as the sheriff dismounted. Morning, Hayes, the sheriff said, eyeing the cabin. Heard some talk in town. Daniel nodded, keeping his voice steady. Figures you did. Folks say you've been keeping company with an Apache woman, the sheriff continued. That true? Daniel didn't lie. It's true. She was freezing to death when I found her. I couldn't just leave her. The sheriff sighed, removing his hat. You know how things are around here. People get nervous about that kind of thing. They think maybe she's scouting or there's more coming. Daniel's eyes hardened. She's not hurting anyone. She just wants to live. The sheriff studied him for a moment. I believe you, Hayes, but not everyone will. I can't protect you from their words. Or worse, Daniel crossed his arms. Then let him talk. I ain't turning her out. Colton nodded slowly. You've always had a stubborn streak. He looked toward the window where Ayana's shadow moved behind the curtain. Keep her safe, but keep your rifle close. Not everyone in this county's got sense. With that, the sheriff climbed back on his horse and rode off, leaving Daniel standing alone in the cold. When he went inside, Ayana looked at him with worry in her eyes. Bad? She asked softly. He shook his head. Just the sheriff. He wanted to know about you. Her face tightened. He send soldiers? No, Daniel said gently. He just warned me to be careful. Ayana sat down near the fire, her hands trembling slightly. They hate my people, she said after a long pause. Daniel crouched beside her. Not everyone, he said. Not me. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes glistening in the firelight. Why you help me? He hesitated, searching for the right words. Because I've seen too much death. And I've been alone too long. Maybe helping you gave me a reason to keep going. Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Then she reached out, touching his hand lightly. A small gesture of gratitude that said more than words could. The next few days were quiet again. But Daniel noticed something new in the way Ayana looked at him. Not just gratitude, but trust, a kind of peace that hadn't been there before. Sometimes when she smiled, the pain in her eyes faded and she seemed almost happy. One morning, Daniel decided to take her into town. You can't stay hidden forever, he told her. If people see you with me, maybe they'll stop whispering. She looked unsure, clutching her shawl tighter. They hate me, she murmured. Not everyone, Daniel said. And I'll be right there with you. It took some convincing, but finally she agreed. They rode together on his horse, slow and careful down the muddy trail. When they reached Dry Creek, the town was busy. Wagons rolling, children running, men unloading barrels by the general store. But when Daniel walked through with Ayana beside him, the noise seemed to fade. People turned and stared, whispers followed them. Some looked curious, others angry. The blacksmith paused his hammer mid-swing. A woman at the well pulled her child closer. Ayana's eyes dropped to the ground and Daniel felt his jaw tighten. He led her into the general store where old Carter stood behind the counter again. The man's face hardened when he saw her. Didn't think you'd bring her here, Hayes, he said. She's with me, Daniel said simply. We're just here for supplies. Carter said nothing more, but his expression said plenty. Daniel paid quickly and left. Outside, Ayana stopped, her eyes shining with unshed tears. They think bad, she whispered. Daniel looked around at the watching faces and said quietly, Let them think what they want. You just keep your head up. They left the town in silence, the stairs following them all the way out. Once they were far enough, Ayana finally spoke. You lose friends? He shook his head. Didn't have many to lose, she smiled faintly at that. Now you have one, she said, tapping her chest gently. Daniel felt a small smile tug at his lips. I reckon I do. When they reached the cabin again, the sun was setting behind the hills. The sky glowed orange and red, and for a while they just stood there watching it. The world was still rough and cruel, but somehow, together, they had found a small piece of calm in it. That night, after dinner, Daniel sat by the fire, sharpening his knife while Ayana worked on weaving something with bits of string. What are you making? He asked. She smiled softly. Charm for protection, he chuckled. For me? She nodded. For both. He took the charm when she finished, a small woven loop with tiny beads, and tied it to the wall above the door. Well, he said, guess that means this place is truly ours now. Ayana tilted her head, understanding most of it, and smiled again. Ours, she repeated softly. Outside, the wind howled faintly through the pines, but the fire burned warm inside the cabin. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring. More whispers, more trouble, maybe worse. But for that night, the world was quiet. And in that small wooden cabin deep in the Wild West, two souls who once had nothing now had something no storm could take away. Peace, and the faint beginning of belonging. Would you like me to continue with part 4, you 1,300 words, in the same emotional, simple, and engaging storytelling tone? The following days passed quietly, though the wind outside reminded them winter was not yet gone. Inside the small cabin, life had grown into a rhythm that was unfamiliar to Daniel, but somehow comforting. He woke early each morning, chopping wood for the fire, fetching water from the creek, and preparing simple meals. Ayana followed close behind, assisting where she could, gathering kindling, mending clothes, and learning to use the stove. Every small task she did brought life back into the cabin, and for Daniel, it was a reminder that even in the harshest of winters, life could be restored. One morning, Daniel noticed her looking out the window, her hands clasped together. Snow still blanketed the distant hills, but the light had changed. It was soft and golden, touching the trees and casting long shadows across the frozen ground. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer. She turned toward him with a gentle smile. "Son," she said simply, her English still hesitant but improving. "Son, come back." Daniel smiled in return. "Yeah, it's been hiding a long time." They ate breakfast together, bread, a little dried meat, and a cup of warm water. Ayanna learned to cook slowly, and her careful hands made the food taste better than it had in a long while. Afterward, they worked around the cabin together, repairing broken shelves and stacking firewood neatly against the wall. Every action was a lesson in trust and companionship. That afternoon, Daniel suggested they take a walk beyond the cabin, into the small valley nearby. The snow was melting, and he wanted to show her the beauty of the land beyond the trees. She hesitated, afraid of the unknown, but Daniel held out his hand. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said quietly. Slowly, she took his hand, and together they stepped out into the bright sunlight. The snow crunched under their boots as they walked, the air crisp and clean. Ayanna looked around with wonder. She had been hiding in forests and fleeing soldiers for so long that this quiet, open land felt strange, but safe. Birds chirped softly, and a deer darted across the distant field, disappearing into the trees. She laughed quietly, a soft sound that made Daniel glance at her with a smile he hadn't known he still had. As they walked further, Ayanna spoke in her native tongue, pointing to the shapes of the hills, the patterns in the clouds, and the distant forest. Daniel didn't understand her words, but he understood the tone, excitement, curiosity, and awe. He nodded and asked her to teach him, and she did, showing him the names of the things she saw. Slowly, he repeated after her, stumbling over some words, laughing when he got them wrong. She joined in, correcting him gently, and the laughter of two people in the middle of a quiet valley felt like the first real sound of hope in weeks. By the time they returned to the cabin, Ayanna's cheeks were flushed with warmth and excitement. Daniel noticed the change in her eyes. There was life and determination there again, not just fear and pain. She had survived the cold, the storm, and the loneliness. Now she was learning to survive the world again, and in doing so, she was teaching him the same lesson. That evening, they sat by the fire, the glow dancing across their faces. Daniel sharpened his knife, and Ayanna wove small patterns with string she had collected from the cabin's corners. She handed him a small braided bracelet, simple but strong. "For safety," she said. Daniel took it, studying it carefully. "I'll keep it," he said. "It'll remind me of today." They ate dinner quietly, the cabin warm and safe around them. Daniel couldn't help but notice the small gestures Ayanna made, passing him the spoon, clearing the table, or sitting close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Each movement was deliberate, showing her gratitude and trust, and it made him feel something he had long thought lost: connection. The next morning, Daniel decided to take a short ride into town. He needed supplies and wanted to test how people would react now that Ayanna had regained her strength. She insisted on accompanying him, determined not to be left alone. The journey into Dry Creek was tense. They moved slowly, the horse picking its way through the thawing snow. When they reached the outskirts of town, people stopped and stared. Whispers followed them down the main street. Daniel felt the weight of judgment in the air, but he held his head high and stayed close to Ayanna. When they entered the general store, Carter looked up from his ledger, frowning. "Back again, Hayes," he said. "Yes," Daniel said, steady. "Just getting supplies." Carter's eyes flicked to Ayanna, who stood quietly beside Daniel. She looked around nervously but didn't step back. Daniel felt a surge of pride. Despite her past fears, she was facing the town now. Carter sighed and handed over the goods without another word. Outside, people continued to stare, but Daniel ignored them. "Let's go," he said softly. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, though Ayana's small hand found his on the reins once or twice, a silent reassurance. When they returned, Daniel noticed the way she moved around the cabin, her confidence growing. She cooked a small meal, stacked the firewood, and even tended the garden patch, despite the frozen ground. Each day she seemed stronger, braver, and more herself. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat by the fire and shared stories of their past. Daniel spoke of his lost ranch, the fire that had taken everything, and the long months of wandering that had followed. Ayana listened quietly, nodding, sometimes whispering words of sympathy in her language. Then it was her turn. She spoke slowly of her family, of the attacks and the fear she had carried alone. Daniel didn't interrupt. He knew she needed to tell the story her way without judgment. When she finished, he placed his hand gently over hers. "You've been through a lot," he said softly, "but you made it, and I'll help you keep going." She looked at him, eyes shining, and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Weeks passed, and the cabin became a true home. The fire was always warm, the beds neat, and the small table full of simple meals. Ayana and Daniel had learned to rely on each other in ways neither had expected. She cooked and cleaned, he repaired and hunted. But more than that, they shared quiet moments, talking, laughing, and simply existing together. One morning, Daniel stepped outside and noticed signs of spring. The snow was melting quickly, small flowers pushing through the soil. He looked at Ayana, who was kneeling in the garden, brushing dirt from her hands. She smiled at him, and for the first time, he realized that what had begun as an act of survival had grown into something deeper. It wasn't love yet, not in the way the novels told, but it was connection, trust, companionship, something that warmed the heart in a way the fire never could alone. That night, as the wind whispered outside the cabin, they sat together near the hearth. Ayana hummed a soft tune, one that reminded Daniel of wind through canyons, of quiet valleys, of hope. He listened, thinking of all the storms they had endured, the cold, the hunger, the whispers of townsfolk, and the weight of survival. Yet here they were together, and that mattered more than anything else. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" She nodded, her small hand finding his again. "Yes," she whispered. "We safe?" Daniel smiled. "Yeah, safe. And maybe more than that, huh?" Ayana only looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. In that quiet moment, both of them understood something important. The world beyond the cabin could be harsh and cruel, but within these walls they had built something stronger than fear. A place where trust, warmth, and hope could grow, even in the heart of the Wild West. The first light of dawn crept through the frost-covered windows, spilling pale gold across the cabin floor. Daniel stirred, stretching his arms, and glanced at Ayana sleeping peacefully under the warm blankets he had arranged for her the night before. She looked calm, her breathing even, a quiet contrast to the chaos she had endured before he found her in the snow. Daniel watched her for a long moment, realizing how much she had changed, how much life she had brought back into this lonely cabin. He went outside to fetch water from the creek, the air crisp and alive with the smell of thawing snow. The world was beginning to wake. Birds sang in cautious tones and small animals stirred from hiding. Daniel paused, noticing the first signs of spring, tiny green shoots pushing through the frozen ground, the promise of life returning after a long winter. He thought of Ayana and smiled quietly. She was like this land, resilient, patient, slowly regaining strength and beauty. When he returned, she was already awake, tending the small garden patch by the cabin. She looked up and gave him a shy smile. "Morning," she said, the word clearer, smoother than ever before. "Morning," he replied, placing the bucket of water near her. "How you feel?" "Better," she said simply. "Stronger," Daniel nodded, proud. "Good. Today we can do more outside. Clear the snow near the barn, maybe check the fences." She looked at him curiously. "Barn?" He laughed softly. "Yeah, old one, little broken. I fix it so we have place for animals again. Together they stepped outside into the sunlight. The snow had melted enough to reveal patches of earth, muddy and soft, but full of promise. They worked side by side, clearing debris, fixing fences, and stacking wood for the coming months. Ayana's small hands moved quickly, learning from Daniel's careful instructions. Sometimes she asked questions, sometimes she offered suggestions, and Daniel realized how quickly she was becoming not just a guest in his life, but a partner. During a break, they sat on a fallen log near the creek. Drinking warm water and listening to the rushing meltwater, Ayana watched the stream closely, her dark eyes reflecting the moving water. "Water, life," she whispered. Daniel nodded, impressed. "Yeah, life keeps going no matter what," she smiled softly. "Like us?" "Like us," he agreed, squeezing her hand gently. By mid-afternoon, they heard the familiar creak of the cabin door. Two figures approached, a young boy and his mother from the town of Dry Creek. They had been curious about the cabin on the edge of the woods, especially after the rumors of Daniel's new companion. Daniel stepped forward, cautious but firm. "Good afternoon," he said. "Can I help you?" The woman glanced at Ayana, then at Daniel. "We heard about your kindness, sir, about the girl you helped in the snow." Her voice was uncertain, but there was admiration there. "I wanted to thank you." Daniel shook his head. "Ain't need thankin'. She was freezing and I couldn't leave her." The boy looked at Ayana with wide eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Ayana nodded, her shy smile returning. "Yes," she whispered. The mother glanced at Daniel again, then offered a small nod of respect. "You're a good man. Not many would do what you did." After they left, Daniel closed the door and let out a long breath. "People can be good sometimes," he murmured. Ayana looked up at him. "Sometimes fear make them hide," she said quietly. "But heart shows truth." He nodded, impressed with her wisdom. "You speak true." The following weeks brought more sunlight, warmer days, and new life. Daniel repaired the barn entirely, and together they gathered a few chickens from a nearby farm to start their small homestead. Ayana fed them carefully, laughing when they pecked at her fingers. Daniel watched her with pride and quiet affection. She was learning the ways of this land, how to care for animals, how to read the weather, how to make a small life flourish in the wilderness. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, Daniel and Ayana sat outside the cabin, the air soft and warm. She had braided her hair neatly, a sign of her growing confidence and sense of home. He noticed how much she had grown, not just in strength but in spirit. "You've done well," he said quietly. She tilted her head. "We together," she corrected gently. Daniel smiled, realizing she was right. Every step they had taken, every hardship they had endured, had been shared. She was no longer just a stranger he had rescued. She was a companion, a friend, someone who had restored a piece of his life he thought lost. Weeks turned into months, and spring fully arrived. The creek flowed freely, the fields turned green, and flowers blossomed around the cabin. Ayana moved with ease around the space, cooking, cleaning, tending the animals, and even helping Daniel with small repairs. Their lives intertwined seamlessly. One afternoon, Daniel noticed her sitting quietly near the fire, her hands resting in her lap. "Thinking?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, past. Gone. Now, new life." Daniel reached over and gently took her hand. "We make it together," he said softly. Her dark eyes met his, shining in the firelight. "Together," she repeated. From that moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Their bond was no longer just survival or gratitude. It had grown into trust, respect, and the quiet beginnings of something deeper. The hardships of the past, the snowstorm, the fear, the judgment of townsfolk, had built a foundation. They were no longer just two people seeking safety. They were partners in life in every small and meaningful way. Days passed peacefully, filled with work, laughter, and the gentle rhythms of rural life. Daniel and Ayana learned to predict the weather, to plant crops, and to care for the animals. They shared stories of their pasts, their dreams, and sometimes their fears. She taught him words from her Apache language, and he taught her words from his, creating a small bridge between two worlds. One evening, a heavy rain fell, tapping on the cabin roof and filling the air with the scent of wet earth. Daniel and Ayana sat inside, the fire flickering softly. She looked at him, her small hand brushing his arm. "Storm," Not like last winter, she said softly. No, Daniel agreed. This one's gentle. Just like life now, easier, calmer. She nodded, resting her head lightly on his shoulder. Daniel didn't move. He had long forgotten the warmth of companionship like this, the quiet joy of having someone to share the burden and beauty of life with. He realized now that his act of kindness on that freezing night had grown into something that neither of them could have predicted. A new beginning. Spring turned fully into summer, and with it, the cabin thrived. Flowers bloomed, the animals grew strong, and Ayana's confidence and skills flourished. She could now prepare meals on her own, manage the small homestead, and even ride Daniel's horse with ease. But more importantly, the trust and bond between them deepened. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in gold and crimson, Daniel and Ayana sat on a fallen log outside, looking over the land they had nurtured together. Look, she said softly, pointing to the fields. Life come back, Daniel smiled, his hand brushing hers. Yeah, and we helped it. Ayana leaned closer. We help each other, she whispered. Daniel nodded. We always will. The wind whispered softly through the trees, carrying with it the promise of a future built on trust, courage, and hope. The hardships they had faced, the cold, the fear, the judgment of others, had forged something unbreakable. In the quiet cabin at the edge of the Wild West, two souls who had once known only loneliness had found life, warmth, and the certainty that together they could face whatever storms lay ahead. And as the sun disappeared behind the distant hills, the cabin glowed warmly, a small beacon of survival, kindness, and the enduring human spirit. Daniel and Ayana knew that the world beyond would always be harsh and unforgiving, but they had each other, and that was enough. Together, they had built a life worth living, a home worth protecting, and a bond that would carry them through every season yet to come. This was no longer just a story of survival. It was a story of humanity, trust, and the quiet miracles that happen when one person chooses to care for another, even on the coldest, darkest night. The winter that had once threatened to take everything had instead given them life, friendship, and the beginning of something eternal, hope.